Of all the arrests this year, none has received as much public attention as that of a young graffiti artist.
One of the 80s most infamous cases of police brutality happened on September 15, 1983 at 2:50 a.m. The victim's name was Michael Stewart, a 25-year-old artist from New York. He was caught doing graffiti by the New York City Transit Police, a force whose main job was to prevent vandalism in the subway system.
I'm Detective Bernie Jacobs. I, in conjunction with my partner, Detective Jim McHugh, are the crime prevention coordinators for the New York City Transit Police Department. Graffiti, as the name itself, is not an art. Graffiti is the application of a medium to a surface. I will show you graffiti, such as the letters on the end of that car directly in back of me. Is that an art form? I don't know. I'm not an art critic. But I can sure as hell tell you that that's a crime.
At 3:22 a.m., he was brought to the hospital, badly injured, handcuffed, and unconscious. He would remain in a coma for 13 days and will finally die from his injuries. Michael Stewart was a black man, and his name would be added to a long list of black people being brutalized and killed by the police. Despite the evidence of the police officers beating Stewart up and eventually murdering him, they were acquitted of all charges. On top of the racial motivations behind the attack, the mayor of New York, Ed Koch, launched a campaign against graffiti which greatly suppressed graffiti artists.
Well, it is one of the quality of life offenses, and you can't just take one of those quality of life offenses. It's like three-card Monte and pickpocketing and shoplifting and graffiti defacing our public and private walls. They're all in the same area of destroying our lifestyle and making it difficult to enjoy life, and I think has to be responded to.
The word defacement used by the mayor in this segment will be included in a painting made by the artist Jean-Michel Basquiat. Stewart's murder greatly affected Basquiat, as both artists shared many similarities. They were both black, handsome, skinny artists, and both of them wore dreads. These similarities were brought up in some conversation and lectures held by Chadraya Labouvier, an art historian who focused her research on Basquiat in his painting Defacement. I'll link these resources in the description. Because of these similarities and because Basquiat also wrote illegally on walls, the artist would often say, "It could have been me." In 1983, he was already famous in the art world, but mainly because he was black, he was still considered a bum outside of art galleries. Basquiat was right, the young black artist getting beaten to death by the police could have been him. Defacement was made a couple of months after the tragedy, and the conditions under which he painted it were unusual. The artwork isn't made on canvas, but on drywall. Jean-Michel Basquiat painted it on Keith Haring's wall, who would then cut out the drywall and frame it. Keith Haring also made illegal public art, like, for example, Crack is Whack, a mural which we have dedicated a video to. Haring also made his own tribute to Michael Stewart in his painting Michael Stewart, USA for Africa, made in 1985, where you see the victim of the abuse handcuffed and choked. In Basquiat's rendition of the events, he paints two pink-skinned policemen using their batons on a black figure. On top of the figures, we can see the inscription Defacement, accompanied by a copyright sign. We'll get back to that later. First, let us focus on the black figure in the middle, the subject of this composition, Michael Stewart. But is it really Michael Stewart? I mean, yes, of course it is, but unlike the policemen, he's painted very abstractly. This representation of the black body contrasting with the pink body of the white cops is compelling. Basquiat might have wanted to represent Stewart by reducing his physical features to his skin color because ultimately it's this process, this reduction to one's skin color, that got him killed. Also, by abstracting the image of Michael Stewart, Basquiat could also be saying that this black man being beaten up by cops could be anyone. It could have been me, as he would repeatedly say. He's showing that this is not an isolated incident. It didn't only happen to Stewart. The man being beaten up to death by the police isn't the first one, and he sadly won't be the last. This could be the representation of any black man being killed by cops. This is the representation of a systemic problem. If you're interested in how the black body has been represented, we're currently working on a future video on the art inspired by Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man and, more specifically, Kerry James Marshall's 1980, A Portrait of the Artist as a Shadow of His Former Self. Make sure to check it out. Second, let's take a look at the copyright symbol, which was a subject Labouvier brought up a couple of times. What does it mean? We see it in many other Basquiat artworks, and some interpretations have ranged from Basquiat's will to appropriate his paintings and make them intellectual property, all the way to his claim of ownership over himself, but I'd like to give my own interpretation. The copyright could be a challenge to the notion of property, the same way graffiti or writing poems on walls is also challenging the notion of property. After all, the primary and original role of the police force is to protect private property, to protect those who own from those who don't. The same way copyrights protect intellectual property, the police force protects property. Michael Stewart, by doing graffiti, was challenging the notion of property, and one could even say that he was challenging the system which maintains and protects property. Basquiat did the same when writing illegally in public spaces, and defacement, made on Haring's wall, is also, by virtue of being on a wall, similar to a graffiti. The very concept of property disproportionately affects the black community and is an extremely important factor to consider when looking at the massive wealth inequality black communities suffer from. For those unfamiliar with the critique of private property, I will try to explain it very briefly. For ages, political theorists have critiqued the concept of property, namely Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Karl Marx, and, of course, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, who expanded on this topic in his book, What is Property? Land is, of course, limited. When collectively owned, nobody technically finds themselves without land, but when the land is owned by individuals, profound inequalities ensue. When you separate people in two classes, the landowner and the landless become dependent on the landowners, and this dependence rapidly becomes exploitative. To illustrate this, imagine a desert island. Let's say you end up on this island with 19 other people due to a plane crash. In this scenario, the island has enough land for everybody to farm and sustain themselves. Now, if everybody decided to collectively farm together and eat the food together, things would be fine. But that's not how private property works. Our current scenario, the one in which we live now, would go as follows. 3 people separate the land in 3 and claim it for themselves. Now, you would think that the 17 other people would find that unfair and that they'd fight this claim. If they didn't fight that claim and ended up landless, it would be impossible for them to farm and to feed themselves. One way to prevent these people from fighting is to create a force that would prevent them from collectivizing the land, a police force. Now imagine these 3 owners hiring 2 landless and really strong guys. The owners tell them, "Protect us and our claim to property, and you can benefit from our land." Now you have 15 people completely landless and starving. They can't work to feed themselves as they don't have access to land. All they have is their labor. They now have to sell their labor to the landowner. They can work for the landowner, be his servant, work his land, harvest food for him, and get some food in return. Of course, if they want to sleep somewhere on the landowner's land, they'd have to pay him in food as well. In this case, landowners don't have to work. the landless, work for them. Nowadays, to acquire property, you must have capital. You must have available money to buy it. If you want to be part of the land-owning class, you need to either inherit property or inherit capital, or submit yourself to a landowner and be privileged enough to have a salary which will allow you, someday, to buy property. Here's how this system is very harmful to Black communities. Slavery has prevented Black people from accumulating enough capital to acquire property. In this case, inheriting capital and property is rarer, meaning that the only way to buy property is by working for and de facto submitting yourself to a landowner. Even then, the process of working to buy property is an extremely difficult one, especially if you add to it systemic racism. In this case, the critique of private property made by both Basquiat and Stewart through their vandalism could be both motivated by their economic and racial background. The title of the painting, Defacement, echoes this duality, as the term could mean either vandalizing, the action which Stewart took part in, and disfigure, the action the policemen partook in. Basquiat's Defacement is not only a tribute to Michael Stewart, but also a critique of the racism which led to the murder by the police force of a 25-year-old graffiti artist. But this social critique, though performed on a wall, like a graffiti, wasn't meant to be publicly viewed. It was made on a wall in a studio behind closed doors. This somehow makes the painting even more powerful, as it was something very personal which Basquiat felt the need to express. It had to be painted somewhere, and it happened to be a simple white piece of drywall. Thank you for watching. With all that's going on with the Black Lives Matter protests around North America, I decided to make this video, and I hope you found it informative and liked it. If you want some more information about the movement and what they're fighting for, I will link a couple of videos in the description. And as always, I'd like to thank all of the Canvas's patrons for the support. If you also want to support the channel, check out patreon.com/thecanvas.